Now in this lesson I want to talk about the switch statement and the conditional operator, and we'll start with the switch statement in this video. Now this is another branching statement that will allow the control of the computer program to jump or branch depending on whether or not two things are equal. So there will be a comparison basically, and based on whether or not two things are equal you will execute a case. Okay, in the previous lesson we talked about conditional execution, so selection statements, and how these allow for basic decisions in our programs. We also talked about how these decisions depend on Boolean conditions. In this case we are not evaluating Boolean expressions as we did with the if-else statements from the previous lesson, because if you remember, let's say you have an if statement, then you have if, and then in between parentheses you have some expression that evaluates to true or false, and based on that it will either execute the next line or it will go to the else part and execute that. Now the switch statement does not quite work like that. It will basically compare whatever you have between parentheses with all of your cases, and then if there is a match then it will execute that particular case where you have a match. Otherwise it will go to the default case basically. That's similar to going to the else part in the if statement, the if-else statement. So this doesn't necessarily again depend on Boolean expressions, but instead again on a Boolean condition. So do you have something that matches? Do you have two things that match? Okay, does your whatever you have between parentheses match one of your cases? If yes, then execute that particular case. Otherwise, or again else, go to the default case basically. So again, it still does depend on Boolean conditions, even though we don't write those conditions ourselves necessarily. It's more like something that goes on behind the scenes basically, okay, under the hood of this switch statement. To the left here we have an example, so switch integral expression between parentheses. Then you have again a compound statement, so between curly brackets. Then you have these cases, so you have case and then a label followed by a colon. Then you have your statement, or you can have a bunch of statements and then a break. Then another case, so label 2, again a colon. Then another statement, or you can have a bunch of statements and then break. So you don't really need compound statements in between these, so with each case, mainly because they will execute sequentially anyway until they reach that break. Okay, so label expressions and the integral expression must evaluate to an integral literal. So again you have some integral expression as opposed to the if-else that we had in the previous lesson, where we had some Boolean expression, so some expression that would evaluate to a Boolean true or false. Alright. Now integral expression is compared to its label, and then if the integral expression and some label match, right, if you have some match there, then the expression under that label where the match is found will execute. So once execution starts where you have that match, so let's say label 2 for example, execution will start, so let's say with that statement, and then it will continue until the end of the switch block or until a break statement is reached. It's important with the switch statement to add these break statements. So basically what the break statement will do is it will exit out of that switch statement. We'll see the break statement again in future lessons, but it will basically exit out of that code block or exit out of that current statement. So in this case, the switch statement, it's also used in loops. So if you have something that repeats and repeats, it allows you to break out of that or to stop that loop. Okay, again, as we'll see later. It's important here to include the break, because if you don't have the break, so let's say you go and execute label 1, so that first case, let's say label 1 and that integral expression matches, then of course that first case will execute, and then that statement will execute right underneath label 1. Then we skip break because let's imagine we don't have that break, then that second case will also actually execute even though label 2 does not match, and then statement 2 will execute. And let's say we also don't have a break underneath statement 2, then that default will actually also execute. So you need to kind of break the switch statement up basically. Alright, so best practice here is that the default is optional, so just like the else part in the if-else statement. So you don't need to include it if you don't want, but it's best practice to include it so that if you don't have any matching labels, so if you have no label that matches that integral expression, then in that case you again have the default statement. So if you have no match, you can print out to the console no match or invalid selection or whatever the case might be. Okay, then include break statements for each case. This is not necessary for the default because let's say it goes to that default case, to that final case, and it executes all of these statements in a sequence, okay, sequentially. What comes right after that? Well, that final closing curly bracket, meaning it's going to break out of the switch statement anyway. So there's no need to include that in that case unless there is some reason for you to want to do that. But for the most part, you probably will not do that. The runtime performance of the switch statement is better than what you have with these long like if-else if statements that we had in the previous lesson. When the switch statement is compiled, the compiler will basically create a jump table that it will use to determine the path of execution, so where the execution should jump to basically, again depending on whether or not you have a matching case. Another thing I'd like to reiterate here is that both that integral expression and the labels must evaluate to an integral literal, okay, and this is one of the things that allows the compiler to do this. And so if you have a floating literal, floating expression, for example, then it's best to use the if-else statement. Okay, in this quick example, you can see that I have a character variable called health pack size, and I initialize that to m. So the switch statement between the parentheses, I pass in that variable, and then this should match these cases. You can see that in the case where we have a lowercase m, okay, in that character, I actually don't have anything, so I don't have a statement and a break statement. So what's going to happen is it's going to reach this case. This will match with this variable. Sometimes this is also known as the selector. Okay, so that's going to match with this case. And so this will execute from here down. And because we don't have anything here to break out, it's just going to continue. So it's going to continue and it's going to execute this statement right here and print that stuff out. And it's going to break out of this switch statement. Control F5 to run that, and you'll see that is what happens. So medium health pack administered. Okay, so let's change that to L. Pull and run that. And you can see that this will now print out large health pack. Okay, so it's going to go down here. This will match, and then it will print this out. And again, break out of this. So if I put something like, if I do something like 3, then it's going to print out no health pack administered. Okay, that it will jump to the default case basically, and then it will do whatever you want to do in here. These statements will execute, okay, till it reaches the end. So you can do multiple statements. Okay, as you can see, you can have multiple statements until it reaches the end of that. So you don't need a break right here, unless you are doing something, specific. So let's set that to yes. And then what we're going to do is comment out all of those break statements. We'll leave them here so that we can see them and we can see they are commented out. So what should happen now is it's going to match. This selector here will match with this case. So execution is going to jump from here to this line, and it's going to execute down. It's going to execute this statement, and it's just going to continue. It won't reach a break statement here because we don't have one. Currently it's all commented out. So it's going to continue until it reaches this closing curly brace. Okay, so let's just see that. Control F5 to run, and you can see it executes all of that stuff now. Small health pack administered, medium, large, and no health pack administered. Okay, so it's even going to execute the default as well. So just keep this stuff in mind when you are using the switch statement. And as you can see, we have multiple cases where we want to check for lowercase and uppercase, for example. So here I'm just setting a variable. But of course, what you can do is you can do an input, a user input from the keyboard and store that in a variable. Now in these examples, I don't do that because I want to keep these as short, as concise as possible. So I leave that as an exercise for you, but you can do that. And so in that case, you don't always want to be overly, explicit with your input. You want to do some checks. If a guy enters a lowercase or an uppercase, you want to assume that the user at the end wants that option. Otherwise, if they have to enter a specific case, that could kind of be seen as a frustrating experience, frustrating end user experience. So you can check for both cases in this way. So lowercase and uppercase. There are various other ways of doing that. Of course, if you do an if-else statement, you can just do an or, for example, but in this case, we can do it like this. So it'll reach this with a lowercase, and then it's just going to continue. Okay. So I hope you found this section useful. And now I would like to mention before we close off here that you can also use switch statements with something called an enumeration. Now, enumeration is basically a way of keeping track of various states throughout your programs. So if you are writing a game, for example, you have various states. Let's say your character is running or walking or jumping or whatever the case might be. And based on that state, you can have various other things happen. Or you can check for that case. So is jumping, is walking, is running, and based on that do something else. Now we'll talk about the enumeration in module 102, so the next module, and then we'll come back to the switch statement. But I just wanted to mention that you can use this with enumerations as well, and that is especially useful for, again, when it comes to game development, right? So I'll see you in the next video.